But the Uminyar and the Avari alike, they call the Moroquendi, the Elves of the Darkness, for they never beheld the light that was before the sun and moon. Hey everyone, Yoyston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we are taking a look at the Dark Elves of Middle-earth and what became of them, they who never walked in Valinor and never beheld the light of the two trees. Sources will be in the description and cards for more info. My friends, thank you all for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. The Moroquendi, Elves of Darkness, or the Dark Elves, were the elves that did not join the Eldar on their journey to Valinor during the Years of the Trees before the First Age. They were, at that time, two factions of elves that made up the Moroquendi, and they were the Uminyar, those not of Aman who began the journey but did not finish it, spreading across Middle-earth, many who made it west of Rhûn, or even into Beleriand, but never to Valinor, and the true Avari, or the Avamanyar, the unwilling, who never even attempted the journey. But what makes one a high elf or a light elf, and what makes one a low or dark elf? Simply put, the light of the two trees of Valinor, at least in most cases, is this differentiation. If one went to Valinor and beheld the light that shone upon the world before the sun and moon, they became elves of the light. If an elf never did, they were elves of the darkness of Middle-earth. Now, this has interesting implications, as that means a vast majority of the elves throughout the ages of the world were technically dark elves, from Thranduil to Legolas to even Elrond and so forth. However, we must be careful when reading Tolkien's Legendarium because lineage also plays a rather large role. While, yes, technically Elrond is a dark elf, he is, I suppose, more Uminyar than Avari, as he was never personally offered the chance to see Valinor, except at the end of the Third Age, where he did go to Valinor, but he was still a dark elf. However, members of Elrond's lineage, such as Idril or Turgon, had seen the light of the two trees. And so, in some ways, in some cases, it is at least okay to call Elrond somewhat of a high elf, or at least an elf with high elven blood because of his lineage, though he never beheld the light of the two trees himself. We see this same sort of thing with Aragorn, who, at the end of his own life, calls himself the last of the Númenóreans. But technically, Aragorn wasn't a Númenórean, right? He never lived in Númenor. However, we as readers kind of get what he means. He's the last king of the Third Age of men, and he, within his blood himself, carried so much of Númenor that would begin to fade, starting with his son and going onward. Now we have to make the distinction between those that were unwilling to go at all and those that went halfway, because to be honest, I'm more concerned in this video about the Avari, those who never attempted the journey at all in the Far East, in or near Cuiviénen, rather than the Uminyar who wanted to be seen separately from the Avari, as they at least moved closer to Valinor than the other elves, and had at least attempted the journey. Again, these were more of our wood elves, as it were. But what I'm talking about more are the Dark Elves who stayed in Rhûn or further to the east. Now, why all of these people refused the journey comes down to the particular elves, it seems. Some did it to remain apart from the Valar, perhaps out of fear or distrust, particularly after the antics of Melkor. Some perhaps did it to maintain their autonomy and power over their own realms, perhaps. Again, this is even another distinction between those who had started but never finished the journey, as most of them stayed behind simply because Thingol got lost in a forest and was not recovered until the choice to go to Valinor was too far gone. Now, though these elves hold the name Dark Elf or the title, and usually darkness in Middle-earth implies some sort of evil, as typically that is the motif associated with the Dark Lord, dark magic, and so forth, in this instance, Dark Elf more or less is a misnomer in that regard, as they were dark for a different reason, but not because they were evil. But, and this is where we get into the more interesting possibilities regarding these folk, they did dwell in the darkness of Middle-earth, even while Morgoth's servants ran rampant. Even if Morgoth himself was eventually incarcerated in the halls of Mandos, he had, before then, trafficked elves and turned them into orcs. I must imagine that in the darkness of the East, the Dark Elves had to endure evils of which we know very little. This also gets more complicated when we bring Eol the Dark Elf into the equation, because while yes, he had not seen the light of the two trees himself, he was not more Avari than others among the Sindar in Beleriand during the First Age. He was more of the folk that began the journey but never finished it. However, he was called a Dark Elf because he did not enjoy the sunlight, and the forest he was in never really let it through. Hence, he himself earned that title, but he was still different than the Avari. It actually does get rather confusing, and even more complicated. The Sons of Feanor called Thingol a Dark Elf as an insult, but actually, Thingol alone of the Sindar had seen the two trees of Valinor, and was thus technically a High Elf, even if everyone else of his Sindarin people and kin were not. But again, we must remember that particularly after the doom of the Noldor, that had been nearly full rot in the First Age, many High Elves did go back to Valinor after the pardon of the Valar, and most of the elves left in Middle-earth, even if they were descended from High Elves or were of High Elf factions and kin, were themselves technically Dark Elves, because again, they had been born during the First Age in Beleriand, not in Valinor during the Years of the Trees. Now this would also lead to other strife down the road, of course, because many of the High Elves that did remain, such as Galadriel, Gil-galad, and so forth, would assert their authority over the Dark Elves and their factions. They would rule over them. The Sindar, Sylvan, and 6 tribes of the Avari that are mentioned in the War of the Jewels book would all, or at least mostly, be subjected to the rule and goings-on of the High Elves, and or the Sindar Elves, such as Celeborn and Thranduil. In some of Tolkien's earliest ideas about the Dark Elves, they would perhaps be elves captured by Melkor and released to sow discord between the elven enemies of the Dark Lord, but that became personified in other elves of the First Age, such as Maeglin, who betrayed Gondolin, or Eol the Dark Elf, who did some horrendous things in his life. But that is also not to say that the Dark Elves loved the High Elves, because they did not. There were many of them in Middle-earth, subject to the rule of the High Elves, and perhaps didn't even understand the High Elves' original choice to leave Middle-earth, nor would most of the Dark Elves be able to go to Valinor in later ages. Maybe there was jealousy, something like that. These Dark Elves were stuck, fading into spirits or other creatures that their elven fates would dictate. As they were, just like the High Elves, still immune to death through aging and so forth, and their spirits were bound to Middle-earth. However, because they had denied, or their ancestors had denied, their home in Valinor, they couldn't take it up now. And so that fate would be the end of all the Dark Elves that were left in Middle-earth, as many or as few as that would be at the end of the Third Age. To be entirely honest, it would probably not be many elves left, because east of Rovanion, east of Mordor and Harad, had been an absolute disaster area for the people that lived there in the Second and Third Ages, simply because of Sauron. Yet I must imagine that perhaps Dark Elves did play a role in Sauron's games in that land, for better or for worse. And we must remember too that, at least in the War of the Last Alliance at the end of the Second Age, Tolkien states that all manner of folk fought on both sides, save the elves, who were all united under Gil-galad's banner. Therefore, the Dark Elves at the end of the Second Age did not fight for Sauron, and perhaps similarly to the Blue Wizards, they might have actually had their own battles against Sauron and his forces, which would help in the West. So what happened to the Dark Elves after the Third Age? Assuming there were some left, and surely there were, it is likely that these Dark Elves spent time in peace, and maybe seclusion, as they slowly descended into the fate that awaited all elves in the later days of the world, those who came not to Valinor at least. But we have seen resurrection before. It could be that these elves were forced to stay as shades in Middle-earth, haunting the spiritual grounds of dead Avari. Or they were spirits in Mandos's halls, or maybe they were even given the chance to come to Valinor as spirits and be reincarnated there once more, and become, not technically High Elves as the two trees were gone, but something like that in the lands of the Valar, having some sort of redemption for denying the gods in the first place. And so, my friends, we come to the end of our tale on what happened to the Dark Elves of Middle-earth. From this tale, we see that we, each of us, carry different stories and lore in our families and cultures. Who are we to judge what others have gone through, the choices that they have made? Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this tale on the Dark Elves of Middle-earth. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts on the Dark Elves of Middle-earth? Let me know in the comments below. They absolutely live rent-free in the back of my mind as they exist in the distant lands of Middle-earth, doing unknown deeds but never forgotten. If If you'd like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles from our friends Mythologie Candles, or order some White or United Cutlery, Lord of the Rings swords, statues, and other replicas from Castle Kon, who does international shipping, and use the code WEST at checkout, and please check out our merch. Join our memberships in Patreon for access to our Discord and our monthly podcast, an episode of which we came out with here last week. Thanks to our Valar tier patrons and YouTube members, Ed Patterson, ComicNut64, Brian Hunley, Peter Shepard, John Hume, Reese Jenkins, Arthur Merlin, Theodore, Andrew Carlisle, and Zoomi. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the free peoples today. And I'll see you all again next week with a video on a power ranking tier list for the Valar. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.